My daughter had just survived major heart surgery when her husband stood in her bedroom doorway and said, "This will all be over soon." The next morning, he left with his mother and sister on a 60-day expedition. Before leaving, they locked her inside the mansion, cut the power, and took the medicine keeping her alive. They believed no one would discover what they had done, but they had overlooked one thing. 60 days later, they returned expecting an inheritance. The moment the front door opened, my daughter stepped onto the staircase and looked straight at them. What she said next made all three turn pale. "Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments, what country or city are you watching from today? Let's see how far Revenge Dad reaches." This story includes fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, the lessons, however, are not. The first time Marcus Hale called me Dad, we were standing on the terrace of my office on the 23rd floor of the Callaway Logistics headquarters on 6th Avenue. It was a clear October morning, the kind New York occasionally produces, like a gift-sharp blue sky, cold, clean air, the city laid out below us like something that could actually be understood from a distance. Marcus was holding a cup of coffee I'd had my assistant bring up, and he was looking out at the Hudson with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in rooms he'd never paid for. "I want you to know something, Dad," he said, turning to me with that steady gaze of his. "I didn't marry Claire for any of this. I need you to believe that." I looked at him for a moment. He was 31 years old, then 3 years into his career as a corporate attorney, always turned out in suits that fit like they'd been stitched directly onto his frame. He had the kind of face that made people trust him, open, attentive, the eyes of a man who listened carefully before he spoke. "I believe you," I said. "I meant it. God help me, I meant every word of it. That was 3 years ago. I've spent the last 60 days making sure Marcus Hale never calls anyone Dad again. My name is Walter Calloway. I'm 60 years old, and for the better part of my adult life, I have believed that the most dangerous thing a man can do is confuse what he's built with who he is. I built Callaway Logistics from 2 second-hand freight trucks and a storage unit in the Bronx into one of the largest regional transport networks on the eastern seaboard. We move freight across 14 states. We employ over 900 people. The company turns somewhere north of $200 million a year. And I can tell you the name of every dispatcher who was with me in the first decade because those are the people who made it real. But none of that, not one contract, not one warehouse, not $1, is what I'm proud of. What I'm proud of is Claire. Her mother, Margaret, was the kind of woman who made every room she walked into feel like it had been waiting for her. She had a laugh that could cut through a bad day like sunlight through fog, and a way of looking at you that made you feel seen all the way down. We lost her to pancreatic cancer 11 years ago when Claire was 17. The diagnosis came in January. She was gone by June. I remember sitting in the hospital corridor after the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do, and Claire reached over and took my hand. She was 17 years old, and her mother was dying, and she was the one comforting me. She held my hand and said, "We're going to be okay, Dad. We're going to figure it out together." We did. It wasn't graceful and it wasn't easy, and there were nights in that first year when the house felt so empty I didn't know what to do with myself. But Claire was there, and she was so much like her mother, the same warmth, the same quiet strength, the same way of finding something worth smiling about, even when the circumstances didn't deserve it, that getting through each day became possible. She grew up without any interest in the money or what came with it. She never wanted her name in the business press. She studied literature at Columbia, spent 2 years teaching reading to elementary school kids in the Bronx, and when she finally told me she wanted to go back to school for her master's degree, her eyes lit up the way Margaret's used to when she talked about something she cared about. I wrote the tuition check with the happiest hands I've ever had. When Claire brought Marcus home for the first time, I was cautious. I'm always cautious about men who come into my daughter's life because I know what's attached to her name, whether she wants it to be or not. But Marcus was different, or performed being different, with such consistency that I couldn't find the seam. He asked intelligent questions and waited for the full answer before responding. He pushed back respectfully when he disagreed with me, which I respected far more than easy agreement. He called me sir for the first 6 months, then shifted to Dad so naturally that I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened. He told me once over dinner at a steakhouse on West 44th Street that the Calloway name made him feel the pressure of a man trying to prove he belonged, not the comfort of someone who thought he'd found a shortcut. That's the right way to feel about it, I told him. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you. In the second year of their marriage, I made a decision I now understand was a mistake, though it didn't look like one at the time. I was preparing to step back from the day-to-day operations of the company my cardiologist had been after me about my blood pressure, and Raymond Stafford, my attorney of 20 years, had been quietly recommending for months that I begin the process of transition. I offered Marcus a temporary operational role overseeing 3 of our regional distribution branches, a test I told myself, a way to see how he handled responsibility before I made any permanent decisions about the company's future structure. Marcus accepted with exactly the right amount of gratitude, not too eager, not falsely modest. "I won't let you down, Dad," he said, and his voice was so steady and so warm that my chest ached with something I can only describe as relief. One evening about 4 months into his role, Marcus and I were having bourbon on the terrace. After dinner, Claire had gone to bed early with a headache, and he asked me a question that I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count. "Can I ask you something about the company's ownership structure?" he said. "Just so I understand it properly. In terms of inheritance and succession planning, how is the equity currently distributed?" I told him, clearly and completely because he was family, and it seemed like exactly the kind of responsible question a man in his position should be asking. He nodded thoughtfully, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "That makes sense," he said. "Claire's a lucky woman to have a father who thinks ahead." I thought it was the comment of a man taking his responsibilities seriously. 3 months later, my daughter went into emergency cardiac surgery, and everything I thought I knew about Marcus Hale began to unravel. Claire came home from the hospital on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the surgery. She was pale and thin, in a way that made my throat tighten every time I looked at her. Not the pale of someone who needed rest, but the pale of someone who had been genuinely close to the edge and hadn't quite made it all the way back yet. The surgical team at New York Presbyterian had repaired the defect in her mitral valve, but the recovery protocol was strict and unforgiving: complete bed rest for a minimum of 3 months, medication administered at precise intervals every single day, a portable oxygen concentrator on standby at all times, and a cardiac monitor that beeped softly every few seconds like a small, insistent reminder of how fragile the whole arrangement was. I had already contacted a private nursing agency, 3 qualified nurses rotating 8-hour shifts around the clock. I'd interviewed each one personally and checked their references twice. I told Marcus the week before Claire was discharged. He looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression of such gentle concern that I almost didn't notice how carefully it had been arranged on his face. "Walter," he said, setting down his coffee cup, "I hear you, and I know you want the best for her. But Claire told me herself she doesn't want strangers in the house while she's recovering. She needs to feel safe, not managed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something intimate and reasonable. "We can handle this as a family. Mom is already offering to come stay. Brooke wants to help. Claire needs people who love her, not people on a payroll." I looked at him for a long moment, my jaw tight. Something in my chest pushed back against his words, a low and wordless unease I couldn't yet name. "She needs her medication on time," I said, "every single day, without exception." "Absolutely," Marcus said, meeting my eyes with total steadiness. "I give you my word." I should have trusted the unease. I should have trusted it completely. Judith Hale arrived 2 days after Claire came home, pulling up to the Riverside Drive entrance in a black town car with 4 pieces of matching luggage and the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided the house belonged to her. She was 58 years old, sharp-featured with the kind of posture that announced itself before she spoke. She kissed Claire on the forehead with practiced tenderness, and then turned to survey the master bedroom with the appraising eye of someone taking inventory. "We'll need to rearrange a few things," she announced, adjusting a pillow behind Claire's head with efficient proprietary hands. "The lighting in here is terrible for a recovery room, and that chair needs to go closer to the window." "Mom, the chair is fine," Claire said, her voice thin but patient. "Darling, I've raised 2 children. I know what a recovery room needs." Judith patted Claire's hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, then turned to me. "Walter, you must be relieved to have us here. Family is what she needs right now." I smiled back at her with every muscle in my face working independently of my actual feelings. "Of course," I said. "Thank you for coming, Judith." Brooke arrived the following afternoon, Marcus's younger sister, 27 years old, and moving through life with the breezy entitlement of someone who had never once been told no. She swept into the bedroom with an armful of flowers and a carry-on bag that clinked faintly when she set it down wine bottles I suspected for the adults who were doing the hard work of visiting the sick. "Oh, Claire, you look exhausted," Brooke said, sitting on the edge of the bed and squeezing Claire's hand with the enthusiasm of someone performing concern for an audience. "But honestly, still gorgeous. How do you do it?" She laughed, tossing her hair, and then glanced at the cardiac monitor with the faint distaste of someone encountering an object that had no business being in a room she'd decided to enjoy. I watched Brooke's eyes travel to the small medication organizer on Claire's nightstand, 7 compartments each one labeled with a day of the week, each one filled with the precise combination of drugs keeping my daughter's heart functioning properly. She looked at it for exactly 1 second too long. My stomach dropped 3 floors. That evening, after Marcus had poured everyone wine in the living room, and the conversation had turned to the Hale family's upcoming social calendar, a fundraiser in the Hamptons, a friends gallery opening in Chelsea, I excused myself and walked to the far end of the hallway. I called Raymond Stafford. He picked up on the second ring. "Walter, what's wrong?" "Maybe nothing," I said, keeping my voice low. "Probably nothing, but I want you on notice." "On notice for what?" I leaned against the wall, pressing my palm flat against the cool plaster. My heart was doing something uncomfortable in my chest. Not pain, just a steady, insistent alarm, like a phone ringing in another room. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I just need you to be reachable." Raymond was quiet for a beat. He'd known me for 20 years, long enough to understand that when I said I didn't know yet, I meant I knew enough to be worried. "I'm always reachable," he said. "Call me the second you have something specific." I stood there after I hung up, listening to the laughter drifting down the hallway from the living room. Brooke saying something that made Marcus chuckle, Judith's voice carrying above both of theirs with the satisfied ring of a woman who believed she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Then I went online and spent 40 minutes researching home medical equipment suppliers. The device I found was a backup cardiac oxygen concentrator, a model with an internal battery capable of running for 72 hours without external power, a built-in cellular modem that sent automated status alerts to a designated account, and a motion sensor that flagged absence of user activity. It was not cheap. I didn't care about that. I registered the device under the emergency services account of Callaway Logistics rather than my personal name. I arranged for it to be delivered, discreetly accepted it personally at the door, and installed it myself in the narrow space between Claire's wardrobe and the wall tucked behind a spare blanket, completely invisible unless you were looking for it. I told no one, not Claire, not Raymond, not Frank Doyle, my head of security, who I trusted with most things. The device was my contingency. My quiet line in the sand, and the fact that I felt I needed one at all told me more than I wanted to know about what my instincts were already calculating. That same evening, I heard Judith's voice from the kitchen below my room. She was talking to Brooke, and though I couldn't make out every word through the floor, 2 came through with perfect clarity. "Trust fund." My hand tightened around the edge of the windowsill until my knuckles ached with a sharp, bone-deep pressure. The unease I'd been carrying since Marcus talked me out of the nursing agency sharpened into something colder and more specific. I stood at the window looking out at the Hudson River, going dark in the evening light, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that for exactly 4 more days. Then I called Raymond again, and this time I had something specific. Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after Claire came home from the hospital. I was at my desk on the 23rd floor, working through a quarterly distribution report, when his name appeared on my phone screen. I picked up on the second ring. "Walter." His voice was warm and unhurried the way it always was when he'd already decided how a conversation was going to end. "Do you have a few minutes? I wanted to run something by you." "Go ahead," I said. "The family has been talking," he said, "and we think a change of scenery would do everyone some good. Judith has been exhausted from the caregiving, and Brooke and I have been carrying a lot of stress with everything that's happened. We've been looking at an expedition cruise, Iceland, Greenland, Svalbard, 60 days. Private vessel, fully staffed, the kind of trip that genuinely resets you." He paused, and in that pause I heard the careful architecture of what he was about to say next. "We're thinking of leaving in about 2 weeks. I set my pen down on the desk, very carefully. The way you set something down when your hand has started to shake and you don't want anyone to know. "Who's staying with Claire?" I asked. The pause that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. That's actually what I wanted to discuss, Marcus said. We've had a conversation with Dr. Nash, the cardiologist who's been consulting on Claire's case, and she's confirmed that Claire has stabilized enough that short periods without direct supervision are medically acceptable. I'll forward you the email. It has her signature and her credentials. My jaw tightened until I could feel the pressure in my back teeth. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice level with considerable effort, your wife had open heart surgery 3 weeks ago. She cannot walk to the kitchen without getting winded. She requires medication administered on a precise schedule every single day. What exactly does Dr. Nash consider a short period? Walter, I understand your concern. Answer the question. Another pause, shorter this time. The documentation will explain everything. I really think once you read it, you'll feel better about the situation. I didn't feel better, not even close. The email arrived 40 minutes later. It was formatted on what appeared to be official letterhead, Dr. Evelyn Nash. Cardiology Consultants of New York credentials, listed below her name in clean professional font. The language was measured, and clinical patient demonstrates satisfactory post-operative stability, vital signs within acceptable parameters, medication, self-administration, feasible with appropriate reminders. I read it 3 times. It wasn't the signature that troubled me. I had no way to question that. It was the language. Too clinical. Too convenient. The phrasing of someone who had been told exactly what to write, rather than someone who had examined a patient and formed an opinion. But I couldn't prove that either. I forwarded it to Raymond with a single line, "Look at this. Tell me what you think." I called Claire that afternoon. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. And when she did, her voice was soft and slightly breathless in a way that made my chest contract with worry. "Hey, Dad." She coughed once lightly. "Sorry, just woke up from a nap." "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "Better," she said. "A little better every day." In the background, I heard Marcus's voice low close, asking who she was talking to. The shift in Claire's breathing was almost imperceptible, but I'd known her for 28 years. I heard it. "It's just Dad," she said away from the phone. Then back to me, her voice brightening artificially in a way that made my throat ache. "I should probably rest some more. Can I call you back later?" "Of course," I said. "I love you, Claire." "Love you too, Dad." The line went dead. I sat holding the phone for a long moment, my thumb pressed against the screen until the display went dark. Something was twisting in my gut, not suspicion anymore, but something sharper and more primitive. Something that felt very much like fear. I drove to Riverside Drive that evening. Marcus met me at the door before I'd even knocked, which told me he'd seen me on the security camera feed. He was dressed casually, dark slacks, a linen shirt, and he smiled at me with the polished ease of a man who had prepared for exactly this conversation. "Walter, come in. Can I get you something?" "I want to see Claire," I said. "She's sleeping," Marcus said. "She had a tough afternoon. Her body is still adjusting. The doctor said rest is the priority right now." He stepped back to let me into the foyer, gesturing toward the living room. "Come sit down. Let's talk." Judith appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at me with an expression of careful neutrality. Brooke was somewhere in the back of the house. I could hear music playing faintly from another room. The whole scene had the quality of something rehearsed positions taken and held. I followed Marcus into the living room. I sat. He sat across from me and laced his fingers together in that thoughtful way of his. And I had the sudden, very clear sensation of sitting across a negotiating table from someone who had already read all my documents. "I know this feels abrupt," Marcus said, "and I know how much you love Claire, but Walter, we need this. Judith has barely slept in 3 weeks. Brooke had to put her entire life on hold. And honestly," he looked down briefly, then back up at me, and his eyes were doing something complicated, something that wanted to look like honesty. "I've been running on empty. I need to know that when I come back, I'm going to be the husband Claire deserves. I can't give her that if I'm depleted." I looked at him for a long moment. My hands were completely still in my lap. My voice when I spoke came out quieter than I intended. "If something happens to her while you're gone..." "Nothing is going to happen," Marcus said firmly. "Dr. Nash has signed off. We'll have a home health aide check in every few days. Claire has her phone, and we're only a flight away if anything urgent comes up." On the way out, I passed through the corridor near the kitchen and saw Brooke pulling Claire's large medication organizer from the cabinet shelf. She was holding it loosely, examining the labeled compartments with the idle curiosity of someone who hadn't yet decided what to do with what they were holding. She looked up and saw me watching. She smiled. "Just reorganizing," she said lightly. I smiled back. I said goodnight. I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel on Riverside Drive for 6 minutes, I know, because I watched the clock on the dashboard and I called Frank Doyle. Frank had been my head of security for 11 years. He was a former Secret Service agent, 55 years old, built like a man who had never once in his life made a hasty decision. He picked up on the first ring. "Mr. Calloway." "Frank," I said, "I need you to be on standby, starting now." "Understood," Frank said, without asking a single question. That was one of the things I valued most about him. 2 days later, Marcus sent me a text at 11 in the morning, all set for tomorrow night. JFK to Reykjavik, 11:15 p.m. Talk soon. I called Claire's phone immediately. It went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice bright and clear and completely unreachable. I called again at 3 in the afternoon. Voicemail. I called at 7 in the evening. Voicemail. That night I stood at my window, watching the lights of the city, and tried to convince myself that I was wrong about all of it, that Marcus was a man under pressure who needed a break, that Judith was a difficult woman, but not a dangerous one, that Brooke had just been reorganizing medication exactly as she said. I was still standing there at 11:15 when my phone lit up with a text from a car service app, a notification for a ride booked under Marcus's corporate account. Destination, JFK International Airport. Passengers 3. I put the phone face down on the windowsill. My hands for the first time that evening had started to tremble. I didn't find out what happened inside that house until the 10th day after we brought Claire in. She had been conscious for 3 days by then, but the doctors wanted her genuinely stable before they'd allowed anything that might spike her heart rate. Stress, they told me, was as dangerous to her right now as any physical exertion. So I waited. I sat in the chair beside her bed for hours, at a stretch reading reports I couldn't focus on, drinking coffee that went cold, before I remembered it was there, watching the cardiac monitor trace its steady green line and telling myself that line was the only thing that mattered right now. On the 10th day, Claire looked at me from her pillow and said, "I need to tell you what happened, Dad. All of it, before I lose my nerve." I set down the folder I was holding. "You don't have to do this today," I said, though every part of me needed to hear it. "Yes, I do." Her voice was still thin, still carrying that fragile quality that made my chest hurt every time I heard it, but her eyes were clear and completely resolved. "Close the door." I closed the door. I pulled my chair closer to the bed. I folded my hands in my lap, looked at my daughter, and listened. "It started 2 weeks before they left," Claire said. "Not the night they left 2 weeks before." She paused, adjusting the oxygen cannula beneath her nose. Her hands were steadier than they'd been 2 days ago. I noticed everything about her now, with an attention so acute it was almost painful. "My medication," she said. "Someone switched it. The pills looked identical, same color, same size, same shape. But they had no active compound. My heart was getting weaker, and I thought it was just the recovery being slow." She swallowed hard, her throat working. "It wasn't the recovery. They were feeding me sugar pills, Dad." The breath went out of me like something had reached into my chest and squeezed. My hands tightened in my lap until my knuckles burned white and hot. I did not speak. I could not speak. I sat there and let the full weight of what she was telling me land completely because she needed me present and steady, and I was not going to fall apart in front of her. "How do you know?" I managed my voice lower and rougher than I intended. "Because when the real medication restarted here, the improvement was too fast," Claire said. "Dr. Reeves, the attending cardiologist, told me the degree of deterioration I'd experienced in those 2 weeks was inconsistent with a properly managed post-surgical recovery. He said it looked more like a patient who hadn't been medicated at all." She looked at me steadily. "Marcus refilled my prescription himself twice. Said he didn't want me worrying about logistics while I was recovering. I thought about Marcus at a pharmacy counter, smiling at the pharmacist, being attentive, being the devoted husband. Then I thought about what he'd actually carried home. My jaw was aching. I hadn't realized how hard I'd been clenching in it. "Keep going," I said. Claire took a slow breath. Her voice dropped slightly as though the memory required a different register. "The night they left," she said, "Marcus came into the bedroom around 9 o'clock. Judith and Brooke were already downstairs with the luggage. He was dressed for travel, that gray coat with the wide lapels." She paused. He went to the medication cabinet first, took everything. Every bottle, every blister pack, the weekly organizer, the backup supply in the drawer. All of it into a black canvas bag. I asked what he was doing. He said he was just reorganizing that someone would drop off a fresh supply in the morning. Did you believe him? I asked. Claire's eyes filled not the easy tears of someone looking for sympathy, but the slow, reluctant tears of someone recounting a humiliation they hadn't yet finished forgiving themselves for. I wanted to, she said quietly. I kept wanting to, Dad, even then. She pressed her lips together until they steadied. After the medication, he took the laptop, then my phone from the nightstand, then the charging cables. He said the electronics were being moved to a safer location while the house systems were being serviced. She laughed, a short, humorless sound that was worse than crying. I actually nodded. I actually said, okay. I pressed my palm flat against my knee. The pressure helped me stay in the chair. Brooke came in next, Claire said. She went to the medical equipment panel, the one that controls power to the room's oxygen and monitoring systems, and switched it off. Said there'd been a circuit issue. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. Claire's voice cracked slightly, then steadied with visible effort. She didn't meet my eyes, Dad. I thought about Brooke at 27 years old, standing in her sister-in-law's sick room, switching off life-sustaining equipment and choosing not to look at the woman in the bed. I thought about the deliberateness of it, the practiced indifference. Something cold and absolute settled in my chest and did not move. Then Marcus came back, Claire said. Her hands had begun to tremble against the blanket fingers pressing together as though holding something in. He stood in the doorway and looked at me. Then he said, she stopped, swallowed. This will all be over soon, Claire. He turned off the light, closed the door. I heard the deadbolt from outside. The cardiac monitor kept its steady rhythm. Outside distant footsteps, an overhead page, the hum of a city moving regardless of what was being said in this room. I tried to get up, Claire said barely above a whisper. 3 times. My legs wouldn't hold me. By the second day, I couldn't get further than the floor beside the bed. She looked down at her hands. I found my lipstick in the pocket of the cardigan I was wearing, a grocery receipt on the nightstand. I thought if I write something down and someone finds me, at least they'll know it wasn't an accident. I thought about my daughter lying on the floor in the dark in the June heat, with no water and no medication, and no way to call for help, writing on the back of a receipt with a lipstick she found in her pocket. I thought about how much she must have loved me to believe even then that I was coming. My eyes were burning. I did not let them fill. I pressed my fist against my mouth for exactly 3 seconds, then lowered my hand and breathed. You did exactly right, I said. My voice was steady. I made sure of it. You did everything exactly right. Claire looked at me, and for just a moment, her composure slipped entirely, her face crumpling breath, hitching a single tear sliding down her cheek, before she pressed her hand over her eyes and pulled herself back together with a discipline that reminded me so sharply of her mother that my heart contracted like a fist. I knew you'd come, she said, her voice muffled behind her hand. I just didn't know if I'd still be awake when you did. I reached over and covered her hand with mine. There was nothing to say that wasn't already there between us, in the room and the green line on the monitor, in the fact that we were both still here. What I did say after a long moment was this: rest now, I have some phone calls to make. I need to go back. Back to the night before Claire told me any of this, the night I found out how close I'd come to losing her forever. Because the story doesn't move forward until you understand what 3:17 in the morning looks like when you're a father who already knows something is wrong but can't yet prove it. I hadn't been sleeping. Since Hales's car pulled away from Riverside Drive, I'd been operating for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch, waking with my heart hammering, my mind running through scenarios I didn't want to finish. I sat at my home office desk in the dark, working through reports I'd already read twice, drinking coffee I didn't taste, waiting for something I couldn't name. At 3:17 a.m. on the 3rd day, my phone lit up. The alert was red. I'd configured it that way deliberately, so it could never be mistaken for something routine. Callaway Logistics, Emergency Medical Device Alert Unit ID CLOMC0047, Riverside Drive. Status: offline, Forstau, 51 hours, 23 minutes. Last user activity: not detected. I was on my feet before I'd finished reading it. The trembling in my hands stopped the moment the alert came through, replaced by something colder, the clarity that arrives when the thing you've been dreading finally shows its face and there's nothing left to do but move. Marcus, 4 rings, voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Judith, 1 ring, declined. Brooke, straight to voicemail. Claire's number rang 8 times in an empty room before voicemail picked up. I called Raymond. He answered on the 2nd ring. Walter, what's happened? The medical device at Claire's house has been offline 51 hours. I said, keeping my voice even with considerable effort. I can't reach anyone. Call NYPD welfare check at the Riverside Drive address. Do it while I'm getting dressed. Done, Raymond said. I'm calling the moment we hang up. I called Frank Doyle, 1st ring. Mr. Calloway. Immediate presence, no grogginess. Riverside Drive, now. Claire is inside and not responding. 8 minutes, Frank said. The line went dead. I was in my car in 4. The drive from Central Park West took 7 minutes at 3:22 a.m. I remember the red lights I drove through. I remember my hands on the wheel being absolutely steady, not from calm, but because I had no room left for anything that wasn't getting to that house. Frank's SUV was already at the curb when I arrived. He stood beside it in dark clothes, duffel bag over one shoulder, completely unreadable, completely ready. The NYPD patrol car came around the corner 60 seconds later. The female officer nameplate Santos listened as I explained the medical device alert Claire's cardiac surgery, 3 days of silence. Santos radioed dispatch and confirmed grounds for emergency entry. I'm her emergency medical contact, I said. The device is registered under Callaway Logistics account number, available on request. We're going in with you, Santos said. Frank went first up the stairs, his team behind him, officers behind them, me last because Frank had positioned me there deliberately. The 4th floor hallway was absolutely quiet, no light under Claire's door. Frank knocked twice and called out. Nothing. He looked at me. I nodded. First try the door held. 2nd try it held. 3rd try. It gave way with a sound like a gunshot, swinging hard into the interior wall. The air that rushed out was stale and warm and wrong before my brain had finished processing it. I went in first. Frank let me. Living room, dark. Kitchen, dark. Down the hall, bedroom door, phone flashlight on. Claire was on the floor beside the bed. She had tried to crawl to the door, made it 4 feet before her body gave out. She lay on her side, one arm, extended fingers, still curved as though reaching for something. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her breathing was so shallow, I watched her chest for 3 full seconds before I was certain. I dropped to my knees and put my hand on her face. Cold, clammy, real. Claire. My voice came out broken in a way I hadn't planned for. Dad's here. Stay with me. Her eyelids moved. I took her hand in both of mine and pressed it between my palms. You're going to be okay, I said. I've got you. Her fingers tightened fractionally around mine. It was the best thing I had ever felt. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes after Frank's call. I heard them before I saw them, the controlled urgency of people moving fast without running equipment cases, and a collapsible stretcher navigating the corridor. I was still on the floor beside Claire when they came through the bedroom door, and I had to make myself stand up and step back. Every part of me wanted to stay between my daughter and the rest of the world. But the people coming through that door were the ones who could actually help her, and getting out of their way was the only useful thing I could do. The lead paramedic dropped to one knee beside Claire and had his fingers on her wrist before he'd finished speaking. Sir stepped back to the doorway. Name, age, primary medical condition. Claire Calloway, I said. 28. Post-operative cardiac recovery mitral valve, repair New York, Presbyterian, 4 weeks ago. Without medication and supplemental oxygen for at least 51 hours. I paused. Her medication was deliberately removed from the premises. The paramedic looked up at me briefly, just long enough for something to move behind his eyes. Then he turned back to Claire and started issuing instructions in the clipped shorthand of emergency medicine. Officer Santos stood beside me, notebook open, asking questions I answered without fully registering. Insurance carrier, emergency contacts, other residents of the unit. Where are they? Santos asked. Iceland, I said. Greenland, Svalbard. Somewhere in the Arctic on a private cruise vessel. I heard myself say it and understood for the first time completely what those words meant. They had put an ocean between themselves and what they'd done. They were standing on glaciers drinking champagne while my daughter lay on the floor in the dark. My vision blurred. I pressed my fingertips hard against the doorframe until it passed. It was Frank who found the note. He crouched beside the spot where Claire had been lying and picked something up with 2 fingers, holding it carefully by the corner. "Walter," he said. I crossed the room. A small rectangle of thermal receipt paper folded twice, slightly damp at one corner. I unfolded it. Red lipstick, deep burgundy, the shade Claire had worn since college, the same shade her mother had favored. The letters were uneven and effortful, the handwriting of someone working against a body failing to comply, but completely legible. She had pressed hard enough to make sure of that. Dad Marcus planned this. Check the cloud. I read it 3 times. My daughter had known. She had lain on the floor in the dark with no water, no medication, no way to call for help. And she had found a lipstick in her cardigan pocket and a receipt on the nightstand, and she had written me exactly what I needed. She had trusted I was coming. I folded the note along its original creases and placed it in my breast pocket directly over my heart and buttoned it closed. Frank watched me do it. He understood I could see it in the set of his jaw. Not evidence for Santos at 4 a.m. Its importance required protection. That time would come. "Don't mention it tonight," I said quietly. He nodded once. They carried Claire out at 4:23 a.m. Raymond arrived 11 minutes after we reached the hospital, still pulling on his jacket. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad," I said. "But she's alive." I touched the breast pocket briefly. "She left me a note." "What kind?" "The kind that tells us exactly where to start." I looked at him steadily. "Don't call the police. Not yet. Get me every piece of security footage from the last 72 hours, the concierge logs, and the legal status of every authorization Marcus holds within my company." Raymond pulled out his phone. "First briefing," I said. 8 o'clock, my office." I sat down in the corridor, put my face in my hands, and stayed like that for 90 seconds, long enough to feel the full weight of the last 4 hours. Long enough to acknowledge it. Then I sat up straight. 57 days left. And I intended to use every single one of them. Raymond arrived at my office at 8 o'clock, exactly as I'd asked. He set his briefcase on the conference table, took out 3 folders, and arranged them in front of him with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent the night working and wasn't going to let it show. I had been there since 6. The coffee on my desk was my 3rd cup. I hadn't tasted any of them. "It's security footage from the building," he said, tapping the first folder. "Concierge logs, entry and exit records going back 4 weeks. He tapped the second. "Every authorization Marcus currently holds within Callaway Logistics, signing authority, proxy designations, credit accounts." He tapped the third. "And a full accounting of the supplementary cards in Marcus's name, Judith's name, and Brooke's name." I picked up the 3rd folder first. 4 days. $63,000. Not on anything resembling a business expense. A helicopter tour over the Vatnajökull Glacier. Dinner for 3 at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Reykjavik, $1,400 a head. A fur-lined parka for Judith that cost more than most people's monthly rent. I thought about Claire on the floor of her bedroom, 4 feet. That was as far as she had managed to crawl. I closed the folder. "Don't freeze the cards," I said. Raymond nodded slowly. "I assumed you'd say that. Every dollar they spend is a document," I said. "Every transaction has a timestamp, a location, a merchant record. I want all of it, 57 days of it." I looked at him steadily. "Revoke every authorization Marcus holds. File the paperwork and execute it within the week. Quietly, no notifications, no flags, no announcements. Under New York General Obligations Law, Section 5-1511. I can do that unilaterally, so do it." "Done," Raymond said. He reached into the briefcase and placed a printed sheet in front of me. Marcus, standing on a glacier. Champagne glass, smiling like a man with nothing to hide. The caption read, "The world looks different from up here. Grateful for every breath of it," posted at 11:42 a.m. Reykjavik time. At that exact moment, my daughter was in an ICU bed 14 time zones away, a cardiac monitor doing the work her own heart couldn't manage alone. I turned the printout face down. On day 4, an unknown number called my phone. I answered. A pause. Then Marcus's voice, unmistakable, calling from the ship's satellite line, expecting silence because he believed the only person who might have answered was no longer capable of answering. I listened to him breathe for 3 seconds. Then I ended the call. 11 seconds total. I logged it with Raymond. He called twice more, day 7, day 12. Each time silence, each time I logged it. He was using absence as confirmation. It was methodical, I had to admit that. He hadn't planned carefully enough. On day 10, Claire opened her eyes properly for the first time. Not the half-conscious flickers of the first week, genuinely awake tracking present. She looked at me and said, "Dad." I said, "I'm here." We didn't need anything else for 10 minutes. Before she slept again, she looked at me with those clear eyes. "You didn't call them, did you?" Not a question. "No," I said. Something moved across her face. Trust, the deep kind. "Good," she said. "Don't." I reached into my breast pocket and took out the folded note. Red lipstick, slightly damp corner. Check the cloud. I folded it, put it back and called Patrick Shaw. "Mr. Calloway," he said, picking up on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Go through the company cloud server," I said. "Every file, every upload, every automated log from any device Marcus Hale connected to our system." "How soon?" "As soon as you find something, which I think will be sooner than you expect." I put the phone down. Outside, the New York skyline was going gold in the afternoon light. 53 days left. Somewhere above the Arctic Circle, Marcus Hale was raising another glass, completely certain the hardest part was already over. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. On day 14, Raymond called me at 6:50 in the morning and said 4 words that I had learned over 20 years to take very seriously. "Come in," he said. "Now." I was at his office on Park Avenue by 7:30. Raymond's firm occupied the top 2 floors of a building that had been housing serious legal work since before either of us was born, and his personal office had the particular quality of a room that had witnessed a great many difficult conversations and absorbed them all without comment. He was standing at the window when I arrived. Raymond almost always sat, which told me before he opened his mouth that whatever he had found was significant. He turned when I came in and pointed at the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Walter." I sat. He placed 3 documents on the desk between us. The first was a loan agreement, 40 pages dense with legal language bearing the letterhead of a private banking institution I recognized as one of the most discreet and least scrupulous lenders in the city. The second was a signature page with Claire's name printed beneath a cursive signature that I stared at for a long moment before I understood what I was looking at. "That's not her signature," I said. "No," Raymond said. "It is not. It's close." The person who had forged it had done their homework. The loop of the C, the particular way Claire's lowercase letters sat slightly above the baseline. But it wasn't right. I had signed enough documents alongside my daughter's signature over the years to know the difference. $18 million, Raymond said, secured against Claire's equity stake in Callaway Logistics. The loan was processed 11 days ago, 4 days before they left for the Arctic. The disbursement went into an account with preliminary indicators suggesting offshore routing. He folded his hands on the desk. Under New York penal law, section 170(10), forging a signature on a financial instrument of this value constitutes second-degree forgery, a Class D felony. Under federal statute, 18 U.S.C. 1344, the bank fraud component carries a maximum of 30 years. I looked at the signature for another long moment. I thought about Marcus sitting at his desk in the home office of the Riverside Drive property, carefully practicing my daughter's handwriting. How many sheets of paper he would have gone through. How deliberate and patient and thorough he would have had to be. My stomach turned over slowly like something heavy shifting in deep water. "What's the third document?" I asked. Raymond placed it in front of me, carefully. The word carefully was deliberate. "I realized the way you set something down, when you already know how it's going to land. It was the medical clearance letter, the one Marcus had emailed me the morning he announced the Arctic trip, the letter on Dr. Nash's letterhead, confirming Claire was stable enough to be left without continuous medical supervision. The signature on this letter," Raymond said, "is genuine." I looked up at him. "Dr. Evelyn Nash is a board-certified cardiologist, practicing independently in Manhattan. She is not Claire's primary treating physician. She was never part of the main surgical team. She was brought in as a consulting specialist 6 weeks before the surgery at Marcus's specific request to provide what he described as an independent second opinion." Raymond paused. "She signed the clearance letter knowingly, but I spoke with her this morning. She called me yesterday evening. She said she hadn't slept in 2 weeks. He looked at me steadily. "She's in the conference room. She came voluntarily." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Evelyn Nash was 52 years old, with the kind of face that suggested she had once been very composed and was currently working extremely hard to locate that composure again. She was sitting at the conference table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. And when I walked in, she stood up immediately, not out of social reflex, but because sitting felt wrong to her in this particular moment. "Mr. Calloway." Her voice was steady, but her hands when she set the cup down were not. "I owe you an explanation and an apology, and I understand if neither is sufficient." I sat across from her and waited. She took a long, controlled breath. "Marcus Hale contacted me in March," she said, "4 months before your daughter's surgery. He said he was concerned about Claire's long-term prognosis and wanted an independent clinical perspective. He was charming and well-informed." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. One of the questions he asked was, this: if a patient with a congenital mitral valve condition failed to receive her prescribed cardiac medication for 48 hours or more after surgery, what would the likely clinical outcome be? The coffee cup was completely still on the table. My hands in my lap were completely still. I answered him clinically and completely, Dr. Nash said, her voice dropping to something smaller and more ashamed. I told him that without medication, a post-surgical patient in Claire's condition would experience rapid deterioration, irregular rhythm, fluid accumulation, potential organ stress. Without intervention, the timeline to a critical event would be measured in days, not weeks. She looked down. He thanked me professionally and left. I told myself it was a concerned husband asking responsible questions. But it wasn't, I said. "No." She looked up, her eyes bright with something that had been building for 2 weeks. 3 months later, he called again. He wanted a formal clearance letter confirming Claire could manage brief periods without direct supervision for insurance documentation, he said. He also told me that, if I declined, he would file a complaint with the state medical board, claiming I had provided negligent advice that contributed to a deterioration in his wife's condition. He had a recording of our first conversation. He had notes, dates, timestamps. She pressed her lips together until they whitened. "I was afraid," she said, and the words came out raw and stripped of everything professional. "I was afraid, and I was wrong, and I signed the letter. And then I watched the news every morning for 2 weeks, waiting to read that Claire Calloway had died of post-surgical complications." Her voice broke entirely, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, one single suppressed sob that she pulled back under control with visible effort. And then Raymond called and told me Claire was alive, and I couldn't stay quiet one more day. I looked at this woman, accomplished, frightened, her career and her conscience both in pieces, and understood exactly what Marcus had done to her. He had found the pressure point and applied precisely enough force, and she had made the choice that frightened people make. "Dr. Nash," I said, "are you willing to testify to everything you've just told me, under oath in federal court with Marcus Hale sitting 20 feet away from you?" 5 seconds of silence, her hands pressed flat against the table, steadying herself, the way you press your hands flat when the ground feels uncertain. "Yes," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I am." I nodded. I stood up and paused at the door. "Raymond will handle the next steps. Don't speak to anyone, not colleagues, not family, not anyone claiming to represent Marcus. If anyone contacts you, call Raymond immediately." I walked back to Raymond's office and closed the door. I stood with my back to him, looking at the wall of legal texts above the credenza, row after row of dark spines, the accumulated architecture of 100 years of how human beings hold each other accountable. What Marcus had asked Dr. Nash in March, 4 months before Claire's surgery, before the diagnosis had even been confirmed as requiring surgical intervention, was not the question of a worried husband. It was reconnaissance. He had identified the weapon, consulted the manual, and waited with extraordinary patience for the right moment to use it. I turned around. "Add Dr. Nash to the file," I said, "and call Patrick Shaw. I want to know what he's found on the cloud server." Raymond was already reaching for his phone. 46 days left. Patrick Shaw called me at 6:47 in the evening on day 20. I was in Claire's hospital room when the call came in. She had been moved out of the ICU 4 days earlier into a private suite on the 8th floor, and the difference was considerable. There were windows now, real windows looking out over the East River, and afternoon light came through them in long gold bars that made the room feel almost like a place where normal life might eventually resume. Claire was sitting up in bed, reading a novel my assistants had brought her. She had graduated from short sentences and careful sips of water to full paragraphs and actual meals, which the doctors described as remarkable progress, and which I privately attributed to the fact that my daughter had always been more stubborn than her circumstances. I stepped into the corridor to take the call. "Mr. Calloway." Patrick's voice had a particular quality, not flat exactly, but deliberately emptied of inflection, the way it got when he was managing information that required careful handling. I had learned to pay close attention when Patrick sounded like that. "I need you to come to the office. Tonight, if possible." "What did you find?" I said. "I'd rather show you in person," he said. I want you to hear it, not have me describe it." I told Claire I had a work matter to handle and would be back in the morning. She looked at me over the top of her novel with those clear eyes of hers and said, "It's the cloud, isn't it?" Again, not a question. I nodded. She put the book down on her lap and said, "Go, call me after." I was at the IT infrastructure floor of the Callaway Logistics building on 6th Avenue by 7:30. Patrick was alone in the server room. When I arrived, a long, cool space humming, with the particular white noise of 100 machines doing their work in parallel, rack after rack of hardware blinking steadily in the low blue light. He was at his workstation, 2 monitors open, a yellow legal pad beside the keyboard, covered in handwritten notes that I could see from across the room were dense and precise and organized. He stood up when I came in. He looked like a man who had been sitting very still for a long time, processing something that required sitting very still. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway," he said, which was unusual. Patrick almost never directed me to do anything. He pulled a chair beside his and waited until I'd taken it. "Walk me through it," I said. Patrick nodded. He turned to the keyboard and pulled up a file directory on the left monitor, a list of automated uploads sorted by device ID and timestamp. Marcus connected his personal iPhone to the company's cloud infrastructure on the second day of the trip, he said. He used his corporate credentials to access the internal document management system. He still had valid login credentials at that point, because the credential revocation wasn't processed until day 15. He glanced at me briefly. He was accessing operational files, distribution contracts, staffing rosters, financial summaries. I assume he was monitoring the company's performance, perhaps looking for anything that might require his intervention before he returned. He was making sure nothing fell apart before he could come back and claim it, I said. "Yes," Patrick said. "That's what I think too." He pulled up a second window on the right monitor, a list of audio files, each one labeled with a date, a time, and a file size. What he didn't account for was this. When you connect a personal device to the Callaway Logistics cloud infrastructure, you're prompted to accept the company's device usage policy before access is granted. Standard corporate protocol. It covers data handling, confidentiality, and monitoring provisions. Patrick pointed to a line on the legal pad. Section 4.2 of that policy states that any device connected to the company network may be subject to automated logging of communications conducted through or in proximity to the device during the connection period for purposes of security and compliance monitoring. I looked at the line he was pointing to. Marcus clicked accept, I said. At 2:14 p.m. on June 22nd, Patrick said. I have the timestamp. So everything picked up by his phone's microphone while he was connected to our network was automatically uploaded to the company's secure audio log server, Patrick said. Yes. He turned back to the monitor. Most of it is ambient sound, deck noise, wind, what sounds like a dining room, some music. 37 separate audio files over a period of 9 days. He moved the cursor to a file near the bottom of the list, dated 9 days into the trip. But this one is different. He double-clicked the file. The audio player opened, showing a waveform, long stretches of relative quiet, punctuated by clear spikes of voices, speaking close to the device. 23 minutes, Patrick said. Recorded at 9:47 p.m. ship time. I've listened to all of it. I'll play you the relevant section. He moved the cursor to a point approximately 4 minutes into the recording and pressed play. The sound that came through the workstation speakers was the ambient hum of a ship's engine, low and constant, and the faint clink of glassware, and then voices. 3 voices close and unhurried, the voices of people who believed themselves to be entirely alone. Brooke's voice came first bright and slightly wine-softened. She really looked awful at the end, didn't she? Before we left. I almost felt bad. A pause. Then Marcus measured and dry. Don't. Judith's voice sharp and dismissive. Sentiment is for people who can afford it, Brooke. We cannot afford it right now. The sound of liquid being poured. Then Judith again, her voice dropping to something more deliberate. Not quieter exactly, but more concentrated. The way a voice gets when it's saying something it has been thinking about for a long time. As long as the girl dies before we get back, everything belongs to our family. The house, the company, all of it. All we have to do is wait. Brooke, and you're sure she won't? I mean, there's no way she could, Marcus. Without the oxygen concentrator and the cardiac medication, her system will deteriorate within 48 to 72 hours. I asked a specialist about this months ago. These things are predictable, Brooke. That's what medicine is for. A brief laugh from Brooke, high and slightly hollow. The laugh of someone who was trying to match the room's tone and not quite succeeding. Judith, stop making that sound. This is not a laughing matter. This is a business decision. Marcus, she's right. Drink your wine and stop fidgeting. The recording continued for another 19 minutes. Conversation, drifting to the next day's itinerary. Complaints about the ship's internet connection. A discussion about what to do with the Riverside Drive property once the estate was settled. I sat through all of it. I did not move. I did not speak. I listened to these three people plan the distribution of my daughter's life with the same bored efficiency they might bring to a vacation itinerary, and I let every word of it land where it needed to land. When the file ended, the room was very quiet except for the steady hum of the servers. Patrick reached over and stopped the playback. He looked at me carefully the way you look at someone when you're not sure what they're going to do next. What I did next was reach into my breast pocket and take out the folded note. I smoothed it open on the desk beside the keyboard. Dad Marcus planned this. Check the cloud. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Patrick. That the timestamps, I said. My voice came out level and precise and entirely controlled, and I was deeply grateful for that. Every file, every second of audio, I need the chain of custody documented before anything else. The upload logs, the server receipt, timestamps, the device ID confirmation. All of it formatted for federal evidentiary standards. Patrick was already writing. I'll have it done tonight, he said. 3 separate secure copies, I said. 1 to Raymond, 1 to an off-site server, 1 archived under my personal credentials. I paused. And Patrick, nobody else hears this. Not your team, not the IT director, nobody. If anyone asks what you've been working on, you tell them routine security audit. Understood, Patrick said without looking up from the legal pad. I folded the note and put it back in my pocket. I stood up. My legs were completely steady. My hands were completely steady. Everything about my exterior at that moment was completely steady. Inside, something had shifted into a place so cold and so absolute that it felt almost like calm. I took out my phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring. Well, she said. I walked to the far end of the server room, away from Patrick, and stood facing the rack of blinking hardware. I found it, I said, keeping my voice low. All of it. Exactly what you told me to look for. A silence on the line, brief, full. Then Claire's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Are they going to be all right? The recordings, are they going to hold up? Patrick is building the evidentiary file tonight, I said. The device connection to the company network, the policy acceptance timestamp, the upload chain, everything is documented. Yes, they're going to hold up. Another silence. When Claire spoke in, her voice had changed, not weaker but different. Stripped of something, like a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying for a long time. Good, she said. Then let's finish this. How are you feeling? I asked. Angry, she said simply, which is better than scared. How many days do we have left? I looked at the server racks in front of me, 40 rows of blinking lights, patient and precise and indifferent, storing everything Marcus had inadvertently handed us. 40, I said. 40 days. Then stop standing around, Claire said, and I could hear the faint edge of something almost like her old humor in it, fragile still, but present, unmistakably present. Go home and get some sleep. You sound terrible. For the first time in 20 days, I almost smiled. On day 25, Carol Whitmore walked into my office at 9 in the morning, set a manila folder on my desk without saying a word, sat down in the chair across from me, crossed her arms and waited. I had known Carol for 22 years. She had joined the Callaway Logistics Board of Directors when the company was still small enough that all 7 board members fit comfortably around a single table in a rented conference room in the Bronx. And she had stayed through every expansion, every restructuring, every difficult quarter and triumphant one. She was 64 years old, sharp-featured with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular stillness of a person who had attended enough board meetings to understand that the most important information is usually communicated before anyone starts talking. The fact that she had walked in without calling ahead told me something was wrong. The fact that she hadn't said anything yet told me it was very wrong. I picked up the folder. Inside was a single document, a letter of intent, 42 pages dense with acquisition language and due diligence provisions, bearing the letterhead of Meridian Freight Group. I recognized the name immediately. Meridian was the largest regional freight competitor in the Northeast, a company that had been trying to acquire Callaway Logistics through various approaches for the better part of a decade, all of which I had declined with varying degrees of patience. Their CEO, a man named Douglas Reach, had sent me a personal letter 3 years ago, suggesting that a merger would be mutually beneficial. I had returned it with a handwritten note that said simply, "Not interested. W.C." I read the first 5 pages of the letter of intent. Then I read them again. The proposed purchase price was $430 million. The transaction structure involved a complete acquisition of all Callaway Logistics assets, including the distribution network, the real estate holdings, the vehicle fleet, the staffing contracts enlisted separately with particular care, the intellectual property, the proprietary routing algorithms Patrick's team had spent 6 years developing, and the client relationships that represented the company's most durable competitive advantage. The signature line at the bottom of the execution page showed 2 names: Douglas Reach, CEO, Meridian Freight Group, and Marcus Hale acting as authorized representative of Callaway Logistics under power of attorney, granted by Claire Callaway Hale, majority shareholder. I set the folder down on the desk. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, the Hudson was doing what it always did, moving steadily south, indifferent to everything occurring above it. I had built this company looking at that river for 22 years. I had made decisions in this office that had determined the livelihoods of 900 people. I had sat in this chair through recessions and rate changes and supply chain crises, and the particular terror of the early days when I wasn't sure we were going to make it. And through all of it, the river had kept moving, and the company had kept growing, and I had kept my hands on the wheel. Marcus had been planning to sell it, not inherit it, not run it, not build on what it was. Sell it, take $430 million and disappear, and leave 900 people to find out from a press release that the company they had given their working lives to had been liquidated by a man who had never driven a truck, never negotiated a freight contract, never spent a sleepless night wondering if he could make payroll. My jaw was aching. I hadn't realized how hard I'd been clenching it. "When did you find this?" I asked. My voice came out steady, which took more effort than it should have. Carol uncrossed her arms and leaned forward slightly. 3 days ago, she said. A contact at Meridian's outside counsel reached out to a colleague at my husband's firm regarding a conflict check standard procedure before any major transaction closes. My husband mentioned it at dinner. I made 2 phone calls the following morning. She paused. The letter of intent was executed on June 17th, 3 days before they left for the Arctic. I did the arithmetic. June 17th, Marcus had signed this document, or caused it to be signed, using whatever authorization he had fabricated 3 days before he stood in Claire's bedroom, told her this would all be over soon, and walked out the door. He had already sold the company before he left. He had closed the deal, taken the earnest money, and then gone to the Arctic to wait for the inheritance that would make the transaction legal. "The proxy he used," I said. "What does it show?" Carol reached into her jacket pocket and produced a single folded sheet. A power of attorney document purportedly signed by Claire, granting Marcus full transactional authority on her behalf. She unfolded it and placed it on the desk facing me. I had our corporate attorney compare the signature to Claire's signature on file with the company registrar. I looked at the signature. It was the same forgery I had seen on the loan documents, close careful, but not right. The same hand that had practiced on the bank paperwork had practiced on this too. Raymond revoked his actual proxy on day 15. I said. "I know," Carol said. which means the authorization Marcus presented to Meridian was fabricated a forged power of attorney used to execute a transaction worth $430 million. She met my eyes. That's a second count of forgery, Walter, and depending on how the transaction funds were handled, it may also constitute wire fraud at the federal level. It does, I said. Raymond's already building that case. I looked at the letter of intent again, then back at Carol. Does Meridian know the proxy was forged? No, Carol said. They conducted standard due diligence. The document looked legitimate. They had no reason to question it. Good, I said. Don't tell them. Carol looked at me steadily. She had worked with me long enough not to be surprised by this, but she wanted to hear the reasoning. Why, she said. Because if Meridian finds out the transaction is void, they'll withdraw and the story ends there, I said. But if Marcus comes home believing the sale is valid and the company is gone, believing he has $430 million and a completed acquisition behind him, then everything he does in the next 35 days is done under that assumption, and everything he does under that assumption becomes evidence. I paused. I want him to walk back into this city thinking he won. I want him to believe right up until the moment the door opens that all of this worked exactly as he planned. Carol was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the folder on my desk, then at the river through the window, then at me. When she finally spoke, her voice was very careful and very deliberate. Walter, she said, I've been on this board for 22 years. I watched you build this company from regional carrier to market leader. I watched you lose Margaret and keep coming in every morning. I watched you restructure during the 2008 collapse when every other carrier our size went under. She paused. I need you to tell me something, honestly. Go ahead, I said. Is Claire going to be all right? The question landed differently than I expected. Not as a board member's question about liability exposure or succession planning, as the question of a woman who had known Claire since she was a child, who had attended Margaret's funeral, who had sent flowers every year on Claire's birthday without being asked. My throat tightened. Just once, just briefly. Yes, I said. She's going to be all right. Carol nodded. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine for exactly 2 seconds. Firm, warm, and entirely without sentiment. Then she pulled it back, sat up straight, and said, What do you need from me? I need you to convene an emergency board meeting on day 58, I said, 2 days before they come back. I want every member present in person in this building, and I need it done without Marcus having any way to find out it's happening. Done, Carol said. She stood up, picked up the folder, and tucked it back under her arm. And the Meridian contract? Leave it exactly where it is, I said. Let them think they're buying a company. In 35 days, they're going to find out they bought nothing at all. Carol allowed herself a very small, very precise smile, the smile of a woman who had spent 22 years watching this company refuse to be taken apart by people who underestimated it. I'll make the calls, she said, and walked out. I sat alone in the boardroom for a long while after she left. The Hudson moved steadily past the windows. I thought about 900 people who came to work every morning because this company existed. I thought about the routing algorithms Patrick's team had spent 6 years building. I thought about the 2 old freight trucks I'd bought with a small business loan in 1994 and what it had taken to turn them into what was sitting in this building right now. Then I thought about Marcus Hale standing on a glacier with a glass of champagne, already spending the $430 million in his head. I picked up my phone and called Agent Correa. 35 days left. Agent Dana Correa arrived at Raymond's office on day 30 at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, which I noted because I had asked for 9 o'clock, and people who arrive at precisely the time they're asked to arrive are, in my experience, either very disciplined or very eager to establish that they are in control of their own schedule. With Correa, I suspected it was both. She was 41 years old, medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested function over preference and the kind of posture that came from spending years in rooms where posture communicated authority before a word was spoken. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, carrying a briefcase that looked like it weighed considerably more than it should, and she shook my hand, once firm, brief, exactly the duration required, before sitting down across from Raymond and me and opening the briefcase without being invited to. Mr. Calloway, she said. Mr. Stafford, I've reviewed the materials your office sent over. She placed 3 tabbed folders on the conference table with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular kind of meeting many times and had long since stopped finding any aspect of it interesting, except the parts that were actually interesting. I have questions, and then I'll tell you where we are. Go ahead, I said. She looked at me directly. Not the polite eye contact of a professional meeting, but the particular focused attention of someone taking your measure. You've known since day 3 that your daughter was deliberately harmed, she said. You've had audio evidence of criminal conspiracy since day 20. You have documentary evidence of bank fraud and forgery dating back to before the subjects left the country. And you haven't contacted law enforcement at any point in the last 30 days. She paused. Why? I had expected this question. I had thought about how to answer it since the night I sat in the hospital corridor and told Raymond not to call the police. Because if I had called the police on day 3, I said Marcus Hale would have been notified by his attorneys within hours. He would have cut the trip short, returned to New York with 30 days to prepare a defense, hired the best criminal lawyers in the city, and begun the process of explaining away every piece of evidence as circumstantial, fabricated, or the product of a bitter family dispute. I kept my voice even and unhurried. The audio recording becomes a question of context. The forged signatures become a question of authorization ambiguity. The medical evidence becomes a question of post-surgical complication versus deliberate harm. Every piece of what I have becomes a fight, and fights can be lost. I leaned forward slightly. What I have now is not a fight. It is a case, and I wanted a case. Correa looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "That's a reasonable answer. It's also the answer of someone who has been conducting a private investigation into federal crimes, which creates complications. I'm going to need you to understand." "Tell me," I said. She opened the first folder. "The FBI's jurisdiction in this matter derives from 3 separate federal statutes," she said. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343. The use of electronic communications to execute a fraudulent scheme which covers the forged loan authorization, the forged letter of intent, and the electronic transfers executed using company accounts. Bank fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1344. The $18 million loan obtained using a forged signature on a financial instrument, and money laundering under 18 U.S.C. 1956. Specifically the transfer of approximately $2.3 million from Callaway Logistics corporate accounts into accounts in Iceland and Greenland during the subject's travel period. She looked up. Additionally, the conspiracy element 3 subjects coordinating across state and international lines to execute a scheme resulting in serious bodily harm gives us interstate conspiracy jurisdiction under 18 U.S.C. 371. Raymond was making notes. I was watching Correa. "There's also," she said, with a precision that suggested she had saved this for a reason, "the matter of the attempted murder charge. That's a state charge, New York penal law, 125.25 attempted murder in the 2nd degree. My office will be coordinating with the Manhattan District Attorney, but the criminal homicide component falls under state jurisdiction. What we own is the financial crime architecture." She closed the folder. "Together, the exposure for Marcus Hale is substantial. We're looking at a sentencing range that, absent cooperation agreements, would put him away for the better part of 2 decades. 14 years, I said. "That's the number I've been working with." Correa tilted her head slightly, not disagreement, but the professional's instinct to neither confirm nor commit. "Sentencing is the judge's domain," she said. "What I can tell you is that the evidentiary package your IT director assembled is among the most complete pre-arrest documentation I've encountered in 16 years of financial crimes work." A pause, very brief but present. "Your Patrick Shaw is meticulous." "He is," I said. "I want him available for a formal evidentiary interview within the week," she said. "I also want Dr. Nash, and I want full access to the cloud server logs, the building security footage, and the complete credit card transaction history, not the summaries your attorney has been working from the raw data." "Raymond will provide everything you need," I said. "There's one thing I need from you in return." Correa looked at me with the expression of a woman who had negotiated with a great many people who had things she needed and had learned to wait for the ask before evaluating it. "The arrest," I said, "I don't want it at JFK when they land. I don't want it at a hotel or a police precinct or anywhere that is efficient and clean and removed from what they actually did." I looked at her steadily. I want it at the Riverside Drive property, on day 60 when they walk through that door. I want my daughter in that room." Raymond shifted slightly in his chair beside me. Not objection, just awareness. Correa studied me for a long moment. The briefcase was closed in front of her. Outside the window, the Park Avenue traffic moved in its usual relentless stream. "You understand," she said carefully, "that a residential arrest involving 3 subjects creates logistical and safety considerations that a controlled environment does not." "I understand," I said. "You also understand that your daughter's presence at the scene of an arrest as a victim of the crimes being prosecuted is not standard procedure and could create complications for the prosecution if it's perceived as victim confrontation rather than lawful enforcement." "I understand that too," I said. Raymond has been in contact with the DA's office. The victim's presence at the arrest location is permissible, provided she is positioned as an observer, not a participant, and provided the arresting agents retain full operational control of the scene. Correa glanced at Raymond, who nodded once. She looked back at me. "Your daughter," she said, "has to be able to walk into that room under her own power and stand there without assistance. If her medical condition requires support personnel, those personnel need to be invisible to the subjects until after the arrest is executed." "She can walk," I said. The certainty in my voice surprised even me, but it was real. I had watched Claire walk the length of the rehabilitation corridor at Greenwich the previous week, slow and deliberate and completely determined, and I had understood then that she would be ready. "She'll be ready." Correa held my gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her pen and made a single note on the legal pad in front of her. "Day 60, she said. "Riverside Drive. We'll need the floor plan of the property entry point access and a staging plan for my team no later than day 50. She looked up. "And Mr. Calloway, from this point forward, nothing moves without my office knowing about it first. No independent actions, no additional evidence collection, no contact with Meridian or the bank or anyone else connected to the financial transactions. You've done your part. Now you let us do ours." I nodded. "Agreed." She began gathering her folders. Raymond stood. I stood. At the door, Correa paused and turned back. "One more thing," she said. "The concierge at the Riverside Drive building, the one Marcus Hale instructed not to disturb the unit or accept deliveries. I'll need a formal statement from him." "Raymond has his contact information," I said. She nodded. She looked at me one more time with that measuring look, the look that had started this meeting, and apparently needed to close it as well. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "most people in your position would have made this call on day 1. The fact that you waited 30 days, assembled what you assembled, and walked in here with a case instead of a complaint is either very shrewd or very reckless." Another pause. In this instance, it appears to have been both. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a quiet, definitive click. Raymond turned to me. For a man who had been a litigator for 3 decades and had heard most things, he looked faintly impressed, which was unusual enough that I noticed it. "She's good," he said. "She's very good," I said, "which is exactly what we need." I picked up my phone from the conference table. "Call Patrick. I want the floor plan of the Riverside Drive property on Correa's desk by end of day." 30 days left. The 20 days between Correa's office and my drive to Greenwich were the longest of the 60. I worked, I filed, I let Raymond and Correa do what they needed to do, and I did not call them to ask for updates, because asking for updates is what people do when they don't trust the work. I trusted the work. I just didn't sleep much. I want to be clear about something. I didn't spend those 60 days being angry. Anger is a fire that burns whatever you're standing on, and I needed solid ground. What I spent those 60 days being was precise in a way I had never been before. Not in 30 years of building a company. Not in the hardest negotiations of my career, not even in the months after Margaret died, when I had to learn how to be precise about grief, because the alternative was to stop functioning entirely. But on day 50, when I walked into the private rehabilitation center in Greenwich, Connecticut, and found Claire sitting in a garden chair on the sun porch with a cup of tea and a legal pad covered in her own handwriting, I understood that precision had its limits, that there were things that had to be felt rather than managed, and that the only question was when you were going to allow yourself to feel them. The facility was a converted Victorian house set back from the road behind a stand of old oaks, the kind of place that announced quietly and without apology that the people inside it were being taken care of completely. Claire had been here for 10 days. The The doctors at Presbyterian had cleared her for transfer with enough genuine optimism in their voices that I had allowed myself to believe it, which I had been careful not to do too often. She looked up when I came through the door from the garden path, and the first thing I noticed, the thing that hit me before I had processed anything else, was the color in her face. Not the artificial flush of someone who had been moved to a sunnier room, but actual color. The color of someone whose body was doing what it was supposed to do again. She smiled at me. It was Claire's real smile, the one that started in her eyes, before it reached her mouth, the one that looked exactly like Margaret's. My chest did something complicated that I did not have a name for and did not attempt to name. "You look terrible," she said. "So I've been told," I said. I pulled a garden chair close to hers and sat down. The sun was warm on the back of my neck. The oak trees moved slightly in a breeze I could barely feel. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself exist only here in this garden with my daughter who was alive and getting better, and I let everything else wait outside the gate. Then Claire looked at the legal pad in her lap and said, "Tell me all of it, from the beginning. I want to understand exactly where we are." So, I told her. I had been careful with what I shared during the hospital. Weeks she was healing, and stress was dangerous, and there was only so much I was willing to put in the room with her cardiac monitor. But she was out of the hospital now, and she was asking with the specific focused attention of someone who had been lying in bed for weeks with nothing to do but think, and she deserved the full picture. I started with Raymond and the loan documents, the $18 million, the forged signature, the offshore routing. I watched her jaw tighten when I described the forgery, her pen pressing harder against the legal pad as she made a note. I told her about Dr. Nash, the March meeting, the questions Marcus had asked 4 months before her surgery, the clearance letter, and the threat behind it. Claire set her pen down when I got to that part. She looked out at the garden for a moment, her throat working. "He planned this before I even knew I needed surgery," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very even, in the way of someone who has already cried about something and come out the other side of it. Before the diagnosis was confirmed, he was already asking doctors how to... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "He was planning it before I knew I was sick." "Yes," I said. I did not soften it. She hadn't asked me to. She picked up her pen again. "Keep going," she said. I told her about Patrick and the cloud server, the device policy, the automated recording, the 23 minutes of audio recorded aboard the ship. I described what was on the recording without playing it for her because she didn't need to hear her husband's voice saying those things, and I was not going to put that in this garden if I could help it. I told her what Judith had said. I told her what Marcus had said. I told her what Brooke had said and the laugh that had followed it. Claire was writing steadily on the legal pad as I talked. Her handwriting was small and precise. She had always written that way even as a child. I watched her hand move across the page and thought about the same hand pressing a lipstick to a grocery receipt in the dark writing letters, effortful and uneven, making sure I would know where to look. "The cloud," she said, not looking up. I remembered it when I was still on the floor. Marcus used his work phone to check the distribution contracts the week before they left. He complained about the login process at dinner. I thought, she paused, catching herself. I thought if there was any chance he'd left something on the system, you'd know to look. "You thought correctly," I said. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were very bright, not with tears, but with something that I recognized as the particular intensity of a person who has spent a long time in a small room with a very large thought and is finally saying it out loud. "I wasn't sure I was going to make it, Dad," she said. "I want you to know that I knew it was possible I wasn't going to make it, and I wrote the note anyway because I needed you to be able to do something with it even if I wasn't there anymore." Her voice didn't waver. "I needed it to matter even if I wasn't there." The oak trees moved in the breeze. Somewhere in the garden, a bird was doing something persistent and cheerful, and entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being said 10 feet away. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. My throat was tight in a way that I had learned over 60 years to breathe through rather than give in to. "It mattered," I said. "You're here?" And it mattered. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and looked back down at the legal pad. "Tell me about the FBI," she said. Patrick had already delivered the floor plan of the Riverside Drive property to Correa's office that had been done in the first week after her visit. That part was done. I told her about Correa, the briefcase, the 4 statutes, the negotiation about the arrest location. When I got to the part where Correa had said Claire needed to be able to walk into that room under her own power, Claire's pen stopped moving. She said that, Claire said. She did, I said, and I told her you could. Claire was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had written the note that had gripped mine in the ICU, that were now holding a legal pad in a Connecticut garden on a warm August morning. She turned them over, slowly, palms up, then back down. "Help me up," she said. I stood and took her hand, and she rose from the chair slower than she used to, more careful the body negotiating each movement, with the deliberate attention of something that had been taken apart and put back together, and was still learning to trust itself. But she came up, all the way up, and when she was standing, she let go of my hand. She walked to the end of the sun porch, 15 feet. Then she turned and walked back. 15 feet. She was breathing harder than she should have been, and her jaw was set in the particular way it had been set since she was 7 years old and determined to do something people thought she couldn't do. She sat back down in the chair. "I can do it," she said. She wasn't asking for confirmation. She was stating a fact that had just been verified. I sat down beside her. I didn't say anything for a moment because I was working on keeping my face arranged in a way that didn't embarrass either of us. 8 more days, I said finally. Claire looked out at the garden, the oaks, the late summer light coming through them in patterns that shifted and rearranged themselves continuously, never the same twice. "She would have been proud of you, Dad," she said quietly. "Mom, she would have been so proud of you." The words landed in the center of my chest and stayed there. I reached over and covered her hand with mine on the arm of the garden chair. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already contain. We sat there for a while, the two of us in the garden in the sun, and let the 8 remaining days wait where they were. 2 days before they came home, I sat at the head of the Callaway Logistics boardroom table and watched 22 years of work get protected in 90 minutes. Carol had arranged the meeting for 7 in the morning, early enough that the building's lobby staff were still setting up the coffee station, when I arrived late enough that the worst of the overnight anxiety that had been visiting me regularly since day 3 had burned off into something more functional. The boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 23rd floor, all glass on 2 sides. Manhattan laid out below, in its usual posture of aggressive indifference to whatever was happening above it. I had stood at these windows for 2 decades making decisions. This one felt different, only in that there was nothing uncertain about it. Carol was already there when I walked in, standing at the credenza, pouring coffee with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had convened enough early morning meetings to have made her peace with them. The other 4 board members were filing in behind me, 2 of them looking slightly puzzled by the urgency of the summons. 2 of them with the focused expression of people who had read Carol's pre-meeting memo carefully enough to understand that this was not a routine governance matter. "Thank you all for coming in on short notice," Carol said when everyone was seated. She didn't sit herself. She stood at the head of the table I had ceded that position to her for this particular meeting, with a folder open in front of her and the particular authority of someone who had earned every room she'd ever stood in. "I'll be brief because the situation is straightforward, even if the circumstances surrounding it are not." She presented the board resolution in 7 minutes. It covered the revocation of Marcus Hale's operational authority across all 3 regional branches, the cancellation of all signing rights on contracts above the threshold he had been granted, the removal of his name from every authorized signatory list in the company's documentation, and the formal notation in the company's SEC filings that the temporary proxy designation granted to Marcus Hale had been revoked, effective June 5th, the date Raymond had executed the revocation, 2 weeks into the trip. She did not tell them about the arrest that was coming in 2 days. She did not tell them about the FBI or the cloud recording or the forged signatures. She told them only what they needed to know to vote, which was that the proxy arrangement had been terminated for cause, and that the board's fiduciary responsibility required formal documentation of that termination before the proxy holder returned to the country. The vote was 4-0 in favor. It took 11 minutes. After the meeting, as the other board members filed out with the slightly dazed efficiency of people who had done something significant before 8 in the morning and weren't yet sure how to feel about it, Carol came to stand beside me at the windows. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out at the city. "How are you sleeping?" she asked. "Adequately," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give without being specific. She made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Walter," she said, "in 22 years, I have never once heard you describe anything as adequate. Adequate is not a word you use. She looked at me sideways. It means you're not sleeping at all. I didn't confirm or deny this. Carol didn't need me to. 2 more days, she said. 2 more days, I said. She finished her coffee, set the cup on the credenza, picked up her folder. At the door, she stopped and looked back at me with the expression she reserved for things she had considered carefully before saying. Bring her home safe, she said. Not a request, not a professional instruction. Just Carol Whitmore, 64 years old, who had known Margaret and had watched Claire grow up at company events and holiday dinners, and the occasional Saturday morning in this building, when I'd had no one to leave her with, and had brought her in and set her up at the conference table with a legal pad and a box of colored pens. I will, I said. She walked out. The boardroom was empty. I stood at the windows for a while longer, looking at the river. Frank picked me up at 10. We drove to Riverside Drive in his SUV, which was cleaner than usual. He had detailed it the day before, which told me he was preparing for something in the way that Frank always prepared, by controlling the variables he could control and making no comment about the ones he couldn't. The building's concierge, a broad-shouldered man named Gerald, who had worked the day shift on this block for 11 years and who had given a formal statement to Agent Correa's team the previous week, met us in the lobby. He had a copy of the building's entry log for the past 3 months, which he handed to Frank without being asked. Frank signed the receipt without looking up. The elevator to the 4th floor was silent. The unit was exactly as I had left it the last time I'd been here, which was the night we brought Claire out, the night Frank had shouldered the door open and the wrong kind of air had rushed out at us in the dark. The building's management team had cleaned it professionally in the weeks since. The floors had been refinished. The bedroom, Claire's bedroom, had been repainted, the furniture rearranged at her request into a configuration she had approved from the rehabilitation center via a photograph Carol's assistant had taken on a Tuesday afternoon. It didn't feel like a place where something terrible had happened. That was the point. I had wanted it to feel like what it was, a home that belonged to my daughter, that had been returned to her, that was waiting for her. Frank walked the perimeter of the unit with the focused attention of a man doing a final security assessment, which was exactly what he was doing. He checked the entry points, the front door, the service entrance, the windows on the east wall. He noted the positions of the building's interior cameras, which Correa's team had already reviewed. He walked the hallway, the living room, the kitchen corridor, and came back to where I was standing in the center of the living room. Correa's team confirmed staging this morning, he said. 4 agents, 2 in the hallway before entry, 2 positioned inside after the door opens. Raymond had also arranged for the bank's legal representative to be present, a senior counsel from the institution that had processed Marcus's $18 million loan. He would be there to deliver the personal liability notice in person, on the record in that room. She'll have a warrant team on standby at the building service entrance. He paused. She wants you seated when they come in, center of the living room facing the door. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, that she does not want you between her agents and the subjects at any point during the initial contact. Understood, I said. She also said Claire should be at the top of the stairs, Frank said. Not in view from the hallway, only visible once they're fully inside and the initial contact is established. I nodded. I had already discussed this with Claire. She had said, with characteristic brevity, "Tell her I know how to make an entrance." Frank allowed himself the smallest possible suggestion of a smile, at that which for Frank was the equivalent of laughing out loud. I walked to the coffee table in the center of the living room, a low, solid piece of furniture in dark walnut that Claire had picked out herself 2 years ago, and stood in front of it for a moment. Then I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket. The note was there, as it had been every day for 58 days. I unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with my thumb, the way I had done perhaps 100 times since that night on the 4th floor, when Frank had held it out to me by the corner. The thermal paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. The red lipstick letters had faded fractionally, not enough to obscure anything, but enough to show that time had passed. Dad Marcus planned this. Check the cloud. I placed it on the center of the coffee table, not tucked away, not hidden. In the open, where anyone who walked into this room would see it immediately, where Marcus Hale would see it the moment he stepped through that door and looked at the man sitting in the chair behind it. I stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked around the room, the windows, the light, the furniture arranged exactly as Claire wanted it, the absence of everything that had been wrong about this place on the night I had last been here. "Frank," I said. "Sir." "Go get Claire." Frank crossed the room, paused at the door, looked back at me once. He was not a man who expressed things easily or often, but the look he gave me then contained something I recognized, the particular steadiness of a person who had stood beside you through something difficult and was not going to leave until it was finished. Then he walked out into the hallway, and I heard the elevator engage, and I sat down in the chair facing the door. The apartment was very quiet. The afternoon light came through the windows in long, horizontal bars crossing the floor and the coffee table, and the folded note in red lipstick and landing against the far wall in a warm rectangle that moved almost imperceptibly as the sun shifted. I reached into my pocket out of habit, looking for the note, and found the pocket empty for the first time in 58 days. It was on the table, right where it belonged, right where he would see it. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the door. 2 days ago, I had been sitting in a garden in Connecticut, listening to my daughter tell me she had been afraid she wasn't going to make it. Tomorrow, she would walk down the stairs of this apartment under her own power and stand in front of the man who had decided her life was an inconvenience to be eliminated. I thought about that for a while. Then I heard the elevator in the hallway and the sound of footsteps, and the door opened, and Claire walked in with Frank 2 steps behind her, and she looked around the room with the calm, assessing gaze of a woman taking the measure of a space she intended to reclaim. She saw the note on the coffee table. She looked at it for a long moment. Her throat moved. Her chin came up. "Good," she said quietly. "Let him see it." She walked to the base of the stairs and stood there, one hand resting on the newel post, looking up toward the landing above. She was wearing a dark blue dress, and her hair was down, and she looked in the slanted afternoon light so much like her mother that something in my chest cracked open and quietly bled. "I'll be ready," she said, not to me specifically, to the room, to the next 2 days, to whatever was coming through that door. I believed her completely. Before I show you what Walter had been building for 60 days, comment justice. If you believe people always get what they deserve, because what happens next, I think you've been waiting for it since the very first minute. This story includes some fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. If you'd prefer not to continue, this is a natural place to pause. No hard feelings. I heard the luggage wheels before I heard their voices. Marcus always traveled with 4 bags. I counted 4 distinct sets of wheels in the hallway outside the particular rolling rhythm of hard-shell luggage on marble flooring, unhurried and self-satisfied. The sound of people who believed they were coming home to collect something that belonged to them. Then Judith's voice carrying clearly through the door. "I want a shower and a real meal," in that order, and then we look at the property listings Douglas sent over. "Marcus, we have time for all of it, relax." Brooke slightly quieter. What are we going to find in there?" A pause. Then Marcus, with the flat certainty of a man who had already decided, "Nothing we haven't planned for." I sat in the center of the living room with my hands folded in my lap and the note on the coffee table in front of me, and did not move. The electronic keypad beeped outside. Marcus entering his code. An error tone. "What?" Marcus sharply, the sound of him trying again. Another error tone. "Judith." "Marcus, what's happening?" "I don't know." His voice had changed, not panic, not yet, but the first hairline crack of a man whose certainty was meeting resistance. "The code isn't working. I'll try, 3rd attempt, 3rd error. Brooke, maybe the system reset. Can you call the building?" The deadbolt disengaged from the inside. The door swung open. Frank stood in the entryway, filling it completely, his expression. The expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had no particular feelings about it beyond professional satisfaction. He stepped aside without a word. 3 faces in the hallway. 3 people who had left 60 days ago, carrying the absolute certainty that what they were returning to was a settlement, an estate to be processed, a company to be sold, a life to be liquidated. What they were looking at instead was a sunlit living room, the smell of cedar and clean air, and me, sitting in a chair, alive, waiting. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Judith recovered first, or tried to. She took a step forward with her chin up, and her voice pitched at the register she used when she intended to dominate a room. "Walter, what on earth are you doing here? This is our—" "Judith," I said, very quietly. "Look at the table." She looked down at the coffee table, at the folded note with its red lipstick letters. Her face did something complicated and uncontrolled, the first genuinely unguarded expression I had ever seen on her. Marcus was staring at me. His face had gone the color of old ash. The carry-on bag in his hand dropped from his fingers without him appearing to notice. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Brooke had taken 3 steps backward until her shoulders hit the hallway wall. Her hands were pressed flat against the plaster behind her, trembling visibly, her eyes moving between me and the note and the door, and back again, like someone calculating exits and finding none of them available. I looked at Marcus for a long moment. He had called me Dad 3 years ago, on a terrace in the October wind. He had looked at me with eyes I had believed were honest. "You had 60 days, I said. "I had 60 days. The difference is what we did with them." Marcus's jaw worked. He was trying to locate something, an argument, an explanation, the smooth, professional composure that had carried him through every room he'd ever been in. He couldn't find any of it. His hands had started to shake. His eyes were doing something desperate and searching, moving around the room, taking in Frank and the 3 figures in dark clothing, positioned at the edges, and Carol Whitmore standing near the credenza, with her arms crossed and her face absolutely still. Then he looked at the staircase. Claire was standing at the top, one hand on the newel post, looking down at him. She was wearing a dark blue dress and her hair was down, and she was completely, entirely, unmistakably alive. The sound Marcus made was not a word. It was something that came from below language, a short, ragged exhalation, as though something had struck him in the chest, hard enough to take the air out of him. Claire descended the stairs, slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried and completely under her own power. She reached the bottom and crossed the room and stopped 3 feet in front of her husband and looked at him with the level, clear gaze of a woman who had written a note in lipstick on a grocery receipt in the dark and trusted that it would be enough. "How was Svalbard?" she said. Marcus lunged. He moved without warning, without the calculation that had defined every other thing he'd done in the past 60 days. Pure reflex, pure panic, reaching for Claire with both hands as though he could somehow undo the last 2 months by closing the distance between them. Frank's hand came down on Marcus's shoulder like a structural collapse. One movement total and immediate spinning. Marcus away from Claire and down onto one knee on the hardwood floor, Frank's grip on his arm at an angle that allowed for no resistance whatsoever. Marcus cried out a short, high, involuntary sound and went still. Judith screamed. Brooke's knees buckled and she slid down the hallway wall until she was sitting on the floor with her hands over her face, her whole body shaking, making a sound that was somewhere between crying and hyperventilating. Agent Correa stepped forward from the right side of the room, badge in one hand, folded arrest warrant in the other. She looked down at Marcus Hale on the floor with the expression of a woman who had been building toward this moment for 30 days and found it entirely satisfactory. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Don't move." Marcus was still on the floor when I nodded to Patrick. The screen on the far wall came to life. The first image was simple, a data readout from the backup oxygen concentrator registered under Callaway Logistics account, CL-OMC-007. A timeline, a flat line where the device signal should have been. 51 hours of nothing starting at 11:22 p.m. on June 20th. Judith stared at it, her mouth opened. She said, "That doesn't prove..." The second image stopped her. Building exterior camera footage, time-stamped June 20th, 10:58 p.m. The quality was sharp. Marcus was clearly visible carrying a large black canvas bag out of the building's service entrance and placing it in the trunk of a car. The bag had the particular weight of someone carrying glass bottles. Prescription bottles. The room was very quiet. The third image was the credit card statement. 60 days. Every transaction itemized the helicopter over the glacier, the Michelin dinner, the diamond bracelet Brooke had bought herself on day 11 in Reykjavik. Grand total at the bottom, $267,412. Charged to Callaway Logistics corporate accounts. Carol Whitmore stepped forward from the credenza. Her voice was completely flat. "Mr. Hale, for the record, you were removed from every authorized position within this company on June 5th. You had no legal authority to use those accounts for a single transaction." Marcus, still on one knee with Frank's hand on his shoulder, said nothing. His jaw was working, but nothing was coming out. The bank representative, a thin man in a gray suit who had flown in from Midtown that morning, stood up from his chair near the window. "Mr. Hale," he said, "the $18 million loan executed on June 14th carries a signature that our forensic document team has confirmed is not consistent with Ms. Callaway's authenticated signature on file. Under federal statute 18 U.S.C. 1344, the instrument is void. The full principal and accrued interest is your personal liability. Marcus's head snapped up. That's not... Patrick, I said. Patrick pressed play. The audio was clear, the ship's ambient hum, the clink of glasses, three voices in a room that believed itself to be private. Brooke. She really looked awful at the end, didn't she? Before we left, I almost felt bad. Marcus. Don't. Judith. Sentiment is for people who can afford it. Brooke. Then Judith's voice slower and more deliberate. As long as the girl dies before we get back, everything belongs to our family. The house, the company, all of it. All we have to do is wait. Marcus, without the oxygen concentrator and the cardiac medication, her system will deteriorate within 48 to 72 hours. I asked a specialist about this months ago. Then Brooke's laugh, high and hollow and unmistakable. The recording continued. I watched Brooke's face as she heard herself laugh. It happened in stages. First, the color left her face entirely, not slowly, but all at once like a light being switched off. Then her hands came up and pressed against her mouth. Then her shoulders caved inward. Then the sound started a high, broken keening that she was trying to hold behind her hands and couldn't. She sank to the floor. I'm sorry, she said, her voice muffled and wrecked. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I knew it was wrong. I knew from the beginning. I'm so sorry. Judith spun toward her. Brooke, stop talking. Do not say another word. Mom, they have the recording. I said stop. We left her there to die. Brooke's voice broke entirely raw and ragged tears streaming down her face. We left Claire there to die and I didn't do anything, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Marcus twisted toward his mother. This was your idea. You said it was clean. You said there was no way. Don't you dare put this on me. Judith's voice had gone shrill and furious. You planned every piece of it. The doctor, the loan, the company sale, that was all you. Because you told me to, I never told you to forge signatures. Agent Correa raised one hand. The room went quiet immediately, not because she was loud, but because she carried the particular authority of someone backed by the full weight of the federal government and had no need to raise her voice. That's enough, she said. She nodded to her team. 2 agents moved to Marcus. 2 moved to Judith. A third crossed to Brooke, who was still on the floor, and crouched beside her, and said something quiet that I didn't hear. I looked at Claire. She was standing 6 feet away, watching her husband be handcuffed, with an expression of absolute stillness. Not satisfaction, not grief, not anger. Just the particular calm of someone who had survived something and was watching the last piece of it finally be put away. I picked up the note from the coffee table. As the agents brought Marcus toward the door, he stopped. He looked back at me across the room. His suit was wrinkled. His face was destroyed. Everything he had built, the performance, the patience, the careful 3-year construction of a man I had trusted, was completely gone. You destroyed my life, he said. I held up the note. Let him see it one more time. Claire's handwriting, red lipstick on a grocery receipt. No, I said. You did that yourself. I just made sure there was a record of it. Correa's team walked him out the door. After they took Marcus away, the apartment got very quiet. Not the wrong kind of quiet. Not the quiet of the first night. The stale, dark silence that had rushed out at us when Frank shouldered the door open. This was different. This was the quiet of a room. After something that needed to happen had finally happened, the particular stillness of air that had been holding its breath for 60 days and was only now allowed to release. Raymond stayed in the living room to deal with the paperwork. Agent Correa's team processed the scene with professional efficiency, moving through the apartment with their documentation kits and evidence bags quiet and thorough and entirely self-contained. Carol shook my hand, said, "Call me tomorrow," and left without ceremony because Carol had never needed ceremony for anything important. Claire and I went to the kitchen. She filled the kettle without asking if I wanted tea. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where 60 days ago I had watched Judith and Marcus exchange glances over coffee cups and told myself I was imagining things. And I watched my daughter move through her own kitchen with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the coordinates of a familiar space. Her hands shook slightly when she set the cups down. "Your hands?" I said. "I know," she said. "They've been doing that since the stairs." She sat down across from me. "The doctor said it might take a few more weeks, nerve response or something. It's not dangerous." She looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up at me. Dad, are you all right? The question caught me somewhere I wasn't expecting. Yes, I said. Then, no, I don't know. Claire reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her grip was firm despite the trembling. That's the most honest thing you've said in 60 days, she said. I looked down at our hands on the table, hers over mine, the way mine had been over hers in the ICU in Greenwich, in every room we'd sat in through all of this. Back and forth, like something being passed between us, that neither of us could hold alone for too long. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his jacket over one arm and the expression of a man who had finished what he came to do. Meridian Freight Group withdrew from the acquisition this afternoon, he said. Their legal team contacted Raymond at 4 o'clock when the arrest went public. They're reviewing their exposure on the forged proxy documentation. He paused. Raymond says they'll likely pursue civil action against Hale personally. Good, I said. Frank nodded once. He looked at Claire. Glad you're home, Ms. Calloway. Claire's eyes went bright for just a moment, the sudden involuntary brightness of someone receiving something they hadn't realized they needed. Thank you, Frank, she said, for everything. He nodded again. He walked out. A moment later, I heard the front door close with its quiet, solid click. The kettle finished, Claire poured the tea. She set a cup in front of me and wrapped both hands around her own and looked at me across the table in the early evening light coming through the kitchen window. The light that fell on the Hudson every evening, the same light I had watched from 20 floors up for 22 years, the same light that had been here before any of this, and would be here after all of it. She would have loved this, you know, Claire said. She didn't say Margaret's name. She didn't need to. The two of us, tea, no more fighting to do. My throat closed. Completely without warning, the sudden contraction of 60 days of not allowing this, 60 days of precision and control and doing the next thing and the next thing, all of it arriving at once in the space between one breath and the next. I pressed my hand over my eyes, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then I lowered it and picked up the tea. She would have been proud of you too, I said. More actually, Claire shook her head slightly, her own eyes bright. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything. I'm stating a fact, she laughed. A real laugh, short and slightly wet, and entirely genuine, the first real laugh I had heard from her in 60 days, and it landed in my chest like something coming home. We sat there until Raymond finished in the living room and came to find us and said the initial paperwork was complete and he'd need signatures in the morning. We sat there until the light changed and the kettle went cold and the city outside the window went from gold to gray to the particular amber of Manhattan after dark. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about what came next. We drank our tea. We sat in the kitchen that belonged to my daughter. And for the first time in 60 days, I let tomorrow wait. The trial lasted 4 months. I won't walk you through every day of it, the motions and continuances and procedural arguments that are the unglamorous machinery of federal prosecution. What I'll tell you about is the morning of the 3rd week, when the prosecution called a witness Marcus Hale had spent 4 months convincing himself would never appear. Manhattan Federal Courthouse, 500 Pearl Street, courtroom 26B. February cold and gray outside the tall windows. Marcus sat at the defense table in a dark suit that no longer fit him correctly. He had lost weight in detention, and the jacket hung off his shoulders in a way that made him look diminished in a manner that had nothing to do with the fabric. 3 defense attorneys flanked him, all of them expensive, none of them able to do what he most needed, which was make the evidence disappear. Judith sat in the gallery behind him, her posture still rigid, still performing, a dignity she had forfeited on a ship somewhere above the Arctic Circle. Brooke was not in the gallery. Brooke had signed a cooperation agreement with the prosecution 6 weeks after her arrest and was currently seated in a separate room down the hall, waiting to be called if needed. Claire sat beside me in the front row of the public gallery. She had dressed carefully that morning, a charcoal wool coat, her hair pinned back. She looked like her mother. She had been looking more and more like her mother as the months passed, and I had stopped being surprised by it and started being grateful. The prosecution called Dr. Evelyn Nash. Marcus heard the name and went completely still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man who has just felt the ground move beneath him and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. Dr. Nash walked to the stand with the measured steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and had made her peace with it. She was sworn in. She sat. She looked at the prosecutor and not at Marcus. which I suspected was a decision she had made deliberately and maintained with considerable effort. The prosecutor's questions were precise. Dr. Nash's answers were more precise still. She described the first meeting March, his office the careful framing of a concerned husband seeking independent medical guidance. She described the question he had asked if a patient with a congenital cardiac condition missed her prescribed medication for more than 48 hours post-surgery. What would the clinical outcome be? She described her answer. She described the second contact, the threat the clearance letter signed under duress. Then the prosecutor asked the question the entire courtroom had been waiting for. Dr. Nash, when did this first conversation with Marcus Hale take place? March 14th, she said, of last year. And when was Claire Calloway's surgery? July 9th. The prosecutor let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. So Marcus Hale was asking you about the consequences of withholding cardiac medication from a post-surgical patient 4 months before that patient had undergone surgery. Yes, Dr. Nash said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the room. That is correct. The defense attorney was on his feet immediately objecting to relevance to implication to the prosecutorial framing. Judge Owens, a spare woman in her 60s with the patient authority of someone who had heard every argument twice, overruled him with a single word and told him to sit down. I watched Marcus. His jaw was moving. His right hand resting on the defense table had curled into a fist. He turned to his lead attorney and said something in a rapid, low voice, and the attorney put a hand on his arm and said something back, and Marcus shook the hand off. It was the first time in 4 months I had seen him lose control of anything. The prosecutor addressed Judge Owens. Your Honor, in light of Dr. Nash's testimony establishing premeditation prior to the victim's surgical procedure, the people moved to amend the charge from attempted assault to attempted murder in the second degree under New York Penal Law Section 125.25, with premeditation as an aggravating factor. The defense objected, at length, with considerable energy and several case citations. Judge Owens listened to all of it. Then she removed her glasses, set them on the bench in front of her, and looked at Marcus Hale with the expression of a woman who had been doing this work for 30 years and had developed very reliable instincts about the people who appeared before her. Motion granted, she said. The courtroom erupted briefly. Judge Owens let it run for approximately 4 seconds and then brought her gavel down, once not hard, just definitively, and the room went quiet. Marcus turned in his chair and looked across the courtroom at me. I had imagined this moment 100 times over 60 days and 4 months of trial. I had wondered what I would feel when it came satisfaction, relief, the particular release of something long, carried finally being set down. What I felt was very simple. I looked at the man who had called me dad and planned my daughter's death before she knew she was sick, and I felt nothing that required a name. I just held his gaze until he was the one who looked away. Claire's hand found mine in the dark between our chairs. She didn't squeeze it. She just placed her hand over mine and left it there warm and steady, and I thought about a hospital corridor and a garden in Connecticut, and a note written in red lipstick and a girl who had trusted that I was coming. I turned my palm over and held her hand. We were almost done. Judge Owens sentenced Marcus Hale to 14 years. She read the verdict on a Thursday morning in March, her voice carrying through courtroom 26B with the particular flatness of someone delivering a number that had been arrived at through careful consideration and would not be revisited. 14 years for attempted murder in the second-degree bank fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Full restitution. Asset forfeiture covering every account, every holding, every piece of property Marcus Hale had accumulated during the years he had spent building a life on someone else's foundation. Judith received 7 years. Brooke, who had cooperated fully and testified clearly and cried on the stand in a way that the jury had found credible because it was genuine, received 4. The gavel came down. It sounded like a door closing. Marcus did not look at me when they let him out. He had stopped looking at me after the day in the apartment, after I had held his gaze until he looked away. Whatever he had expected from me, rage, satisfaction, some visible proof that he had mattered enough to wound, he had not found it, and I think the absence of it had cost him something he hadn't anticipated. Claire was very still beside me as they led him through the side door. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Outside the courthouse on the Pearl Street steps, the February air was cold and clean, and the city moved past us in its usual indifferent rush. Claire turned her face up toward the pale winter sun. For a moment, eyes closed, just breathing. Then she said, "Okay, just that. One word." But I understood everything it contained. 9 months later, in December, I drove to a converted row house on West 118th Street in Harlem that Claire had leased for what she was calling, with characteristic understatement, a small office. The sign beside the door read, "The Margaret Fund, supporting financial independence for survivors of coercive control." She had named it after her mother. I had not known she was going to do that until the morning she sent me a photograph of the sign being installed, and I had sat in my car for a few minutes before I was ready to drive. The office was one large room divided by a partition with 2 desks and a waiting area with chairs that Claire had picked out herself. Comfortable, she had told me, because people came here on the worst days of their lives, and they shouldn't have to sit in uncomfortable chairs. There were plants on the windowsill. There was a photograph of Margaret on the wall behind Claire's desk, taken the summer Claire was 15, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see Claire at her desk, across from a young woman I didn't recognize, perhaps 25, wearing a winter coat. She hadn't taken off her hands wrapped around a paper cup, listening to Claire with the focused attention of someone receiving something they had not expected to be offered. I did not go in. I stood on the sidewalk and watched my daughter through the glass. She was leaning forward slightly, her elbows on the desk, talking with her hands the way she always did when she was explaining something she cared about. The young woman said something. Claire nodded, reached across the desk, and said something back. I reached into my breast pocket. The note was there. It was always there, had been there every day since Frank had handed it to me in the dark on a 4th-floor hallway 51 hours and a lifetime ago. The thermal paper had gone soft at the creases. The red lipstick letters had faded to the color of dried roses. Dad Marcus planned this. Check the cloud. I read it one more time. Then I folded it very carefully. I put it in my wallet, not the breast pocket, not the place I had been carrying it for 18 months, but the wallet, the place where you put things you are keeping rather than things you are holding on to. It was a small difference. It was everything. I put the wallet in my jacket pocket. I looked through the glass at Claire, who was still talking, still leaning forward, still giving the young woman in the winter coat her complete and undivided attention. She didn't see me standing there. She was too busy doing what she had decided to do with what she had survived. I turned up my collar against the December cold. I walked back to my car. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, looking at the row house, at the small sign beside the door, at my daughter's name on the lease agreement I had co-signed 3 months ago. The Margaret Fund. I started the car. I drove home through the December streets of New York City. The lights, the traffic, the city that kept moving no matter what. And I thought about 2 old freight trucks in a storage unit in the Bronx in 1994, and about Margaret laughing at something outside the frame of a photograph, and about a note written in red lipstick on a grocery receipt in the dark. I thought about my daughter saying, "I'll be ready," to an empty room. I thought about how she had been. Then I stopped thinking about all of it because there was nothing left to think about. It was done. People ask me if I regret waiting 60 days. I don't. What I regret is the years before staying quiet because I wanted to believe the best in people who had already decided the worst about us. This is a family story I never wanted to live. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, wearing the face of someone you trusted, speaking in the voice of someone you loved. If this family story taught me anything, trust what you observe, not what you're told. I believe God places the right things in our hands at exactly the right moment. A backup device, a grocery receipt, a lipstick in a cardigan pocket, small things, enough things. Don't be like, "I was patient when you should have been firm." Family betrayal at this level builds slowly in small silences we choose not to question. My honest opinion, the most dangerous person in your life is never a stranger. It's someone who knows exactly how much you love them and chooses to use it against you. If this family story moved, you drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle reminder, stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to educate and reflect on real human experiences. If that's not for you today, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best.